Welcome to the Newcomer Podcast. I'm Eric Newcomer. I'm here with Madeline Renbarger. Tom is sick. He's like, I'm hard at work on the draft. He's doing work, but we're not making him jump on the podcast. You were in DC yesterday for the Hill and Valley Forum. We're going to have Josh Wolfe from Lux in the second half of the episode. Before we get into it, though, we have to talk about the drama in Silicon Valley. This episode is presented by Brex, the financial stack founders can bank on. Brex knows cash is king for startups, so they build a banking experience that takes every dollar further. Unlike traditional business banking solutions, Brex has no minimums and no transaction fees, and you can get 20x the standard FDIC protection. Even better, you can earn industry-leading yield from your first dollar, while still being able to access your funds anytime. Get the business account trusted by 1 in 3 US startups at brex.com/banking-solutions. That's brex.com/banking-solutions. I'm talking, of course, about the group chats. Madeline, what is the state of your group chats?
My group chats, I'm not in as many group chats with, world leaders and billionaires. Eric, have you ever been out into the group chats?
No cabal group chats. Eric Tornberg, who sort of kickstarted some of this conversation, announced some of them on Twitter, and I tried to get in. But no, I think I was exactly the type of person they were trying to keep out of the group chats. Obviously I have a MSM talking point. Seriously, I have a small thread we call MSM talking points. Another one, debate club with reporters. Anyway, let's give the context on the story. You want to give the quick sort of rundown just so people have that?
Ben Smith published a story about, the group chats that changed America, which was basically group chats kind of really spearheaded, by Aaron Torberg and Mark Andreessen and the Andreessen crew, putting all of these Silicon Valley leaders together with influential people in Washington. And his conclusion is that it really led to this moment that we have now politically with, Trump coming back and Silicon Valley's kind of all gathering in boosterism of Trump and that pitch. Part of it is that these chats are, behind closed doors with the most powerful people in the world. They're not building in public, and they began because backlash to the wokeism and the scolding on Twitter.
Exactly. I think they would say, cancellations and wokeness started this. And then we got chased off the internet. We created group chats. I mean, I think a key one.
How much is being chased off or, just like choosing to leave,
I listen, I've been the loudest on say what you can't say. Like, isn't bravery there? This is a class of people who talks about sort of manly virtues, and bravery is a big one. And then they don't have the courage to say what they actually want to say. It was such a game of like, I don't know what I can't say. And then they go to the group chats. I mean, you can talk to your friends in private. And in some ways, people are like, did you know about this? It's like, I knew they had group chats. And certainly we knew when the Silicon Valley bank crisis that some of these group chats were key to passing the message along. And I think we put that either in the podcast or some stories.
That was kind of an open secret at the time, right? Like how everyone reacted, like we kind of knew about them, but we just weren't in them. Yeah.
I mean, Ben Smith's story in some ways, you add mystique to these things. It's like, a bunch of people talking in a thread, not that shocking, but then it was definitely interesting to see. And that I didn't know, like, for instance, that it's funny that Mark Cuban ends up being the great advocate for Democrats. Like he's out there, but he's not like our best policy mind necessarily. I don't know. I do think sometimes these like conservative led discussion groups sort of pick, it's like Jason Calacanis is the best we have to put on the All In podcast to respond to David Sachs. Like often we're not sending our best, they're not picking among the most sophisticated thinkers. They're picking people who are going to play nice. And, a big point from the group chat story was just sort of Mark Andreessen and people like being like, this, you need to stay on message. Like, and we're going to leave if you don't. Like, it has this great image of, David Sachs and I think Joe Lonsdale leaving a group chat.
It kind of forms its own groupthink within the group chat, right? Like that was the conclusion I got, where it's like, you're mad about the groupthink on your other platform, but joining a group chat of your, people who have intellectual debates, but are all kind of within one set parameter, you don't really have the like iconoclastic leftists in this group chat. It's still kind of your network. So how much of that is just furthering the groupthink you claim to protest?
To me, they read as they exist to workshop compelling arguments and reasons that could be used to further a sort of established conclusion that you need to be sort of against the Democrats. And so then it's like, if you can come up with good arguments for us to use that hit Democrats, like, welcome. But if you're really just going back to the sort of core argument of sort of Trump versus the Democrats, then you're wasting our time. It's sort of more evidence that Twitter is not real life, that like people are not sort of sincerely putting their views on Twitter and everything. But, I think we've known that for a while.
Do you feel like they have the same level of influence now that the chats are kind of mainstream and that's the whole culture? Like it's broken through now.
They're secret. How are we supposed to know? No, well, I think right after it came out, we're in a brief period of like, follow on VCs. Like, I need to get in the chat. So I don't know. There's a spurt of enthusiasm and like people want to be relevant. I mean, Andreessen hired Eric Thornburg, to, I think, create more chats. They'd had Sriram, who's now in the Trump administration, making chats too. So I think this sort of community building through private discussion groups. I mean, YC, has always had Bookface. So
true.
Private groups where people are keeping secrets pretty well it's not totally new. So no, I think this continues. I mean, hopefully, if only the Trump people can eradicate cancel culture, then they'll start saying what they think online. But
if only we can abolish woke and then real discourse can make it back into the arena. We're obviously, at Newcomer and as reporters, fans of building in public. I'd love to either be added to the group chats, but more importantly, I would love the conversations to just be had. Like, I like when people just say what they're doing. And I think that kind of candor and open dialogue, obviously people are afraid of it, but it feels like we've switched to a degree where it's like, who gets to say?
I do think the shortcoming of the media and like or not even the media, but sort of the environment is that if you're an important person and you put a take on Twitter, it seems like you're like fully baked opinion. And if you're sort of in a group chat with friends, you're sort of talking through your opinions and formulating them. And so how do we make a sort of Twitter for tentative thoughts and a Twitter for this is my, established take?
Even from the left, there's no room for breathing, and some like prominent left figures have been canceled for being not left enough when they're just, spouting the shit, and trying to talk through ideas and workshop stuff. And if it's not fully baked, they get come for too, So I think like it is worth it to have a place where you can do that openly and, workshop what you're thinking and be able to freely post a
but Twitter is pretty baked, right? I mean, we tweet like headline, I don't know.
Yeah.
I do think chats are good for ideas that you're formulating. You were in DC yesterday for the Hill and Valley Forum. What was the mood there?
The mood was really celebratory, Eric. I mean, it felt like, honestly, the on-stage panels were a bit of a victory lap for the Silicon Valley China hawks and defense founders who, have been pushing this agenda of, how tech and national security can work really well together, should work really well together. Everyone in the room was really in consensus on ideas that, event co-host Jacob Hellberg has been pushing for, both, as an advisor to Palantir and then in his own work lobbying in Congress for, China hawkishness and better synchronicity between cutting innovation in Silicon Valley and defense and government operations. I mean, really, it felt like that ideology has kind of like become the mainstream in Silicon Valley. Like everyone there is totally bought in.
If you zoom out, last year at Hill and Valley, we were saying, man, they're trying to normalize Trump. They snuck Trump in. We were a little bit like, oh, they're trying to make it okay to be a Republican. On the one hand, it seems a little more like they've got a mix of sort of Democrats and Republicans. On the other hand, it's like Trump won. It's you can't normalize him anymore. It's like he's governing. So there was clearly just like the victory lap on, we're in charge. We get to set the mood. But we did end our story with it felt like Morning in America. But if you look outside, it's like the world is not as bright necessarily as it seems in the room. Did they talk about like the markets and how they can idealize tariffs and say, oh, we should be competing with China on stronger footing. But then as implemented, the tariffs are like insane and going to cause a ton of problems. And it's sort of a nearing train wreck. Very hard to deny that the situation is going to get worse, not better, unless situation changes soon. Or did they touch on any of that?
The tariffs did come up because one of the biggest themes of the day was reshoring American manufacturing. Like, in addition to, defense and space investing, there was a huge emphasis in the panels about how important it is that startups be at the forefront of setting up, this new manufacturing core in America. And so in a sense, the tariffs came up because that's kind of a part of the policy to do that. It was muted skepticism from the people who were a little bit more, hesitant to say that these were a good idea.
They were not saying, oh, the markets are that we're about to enter a recession and that all our enthusiasm could be dampened by
none of
macro.
that.
No, okay, yeah.
Which felt a little bit, just the meta narrative of the event. It was clearly successful, but it was so bizarre to, be in this kind of bubble inside.
Right. Theory, part of investing and being a good investor is making sure you have follow-on capital, right? And so there's sort of a rational cult-like behavior that you get into Silicon Valley where you're like, I need to make sure if I take this risky defense tech investment, somebody else will be the dumb money after me, or at least sort of have conviction that there will be more money until it finally gets to where it needs to be. And so these events, they all need to psychologically brainwash themselves that, all right, it's sort of a group sharing that we're all going to lock in. We're going to do defense tech.
We're going to be hawkish on China. We fully divested from China. America is coming back.
It needs the cult-like behavior, which in some ways is a positive sign for the category because they're saying we're all going to dump money into defense tech, circumstances be damned. You mentioned, I love Emil Michael and Bill Gurley, but Emil, ex Travis Kalanick deputy, former Uber guy from much of my coverage, sort of took a subtle dig at Gurley and Benchmark on stage. What was that?
Emil's now Undersecretary of Defense and was on a panel with Kevin Weil from OpenAI. And
but you don't lose your petty gripes. You don't lose your petty feuds when you become Undersecretary of Defense.
Yeah, I mean, it was basically just, there's been the Bloomberg reporting that Benchmark's invested in Chinese company Manus AI. So,
R for Rock scoop.
Yes, an R for Rock scoop that Bloomberg confirmed.
And they did not credit. Right. They didn't credit. We credit R for Rock if he's first. I don't think Bloomberg mentioned him.
I think the rest of the tech press kind of just it
treats it
really
like acknowledge. He's just a tipster. Like he's right. He's getting it right
almost at the time.
It's one thing if he's like sort of anyway. Yeah, keep going. Anyway, Benchmark.
Emil was just kind of like, it's not like there's not a plethora of US companies doing AI to invest in right now, so I would say it was like, subtle, but not so subtle.
Sorry, he was shitting on Benchmark's investment in Manus, and saying, oh, they could have found US companies. And I mean, we said this in the story. What's more contrarian than being pro-China? A lot of these people self-criticize VCs for not being contrarian. And then what it would be truly contrarian? A little sort of like comfort with China from Benchmark, which I think is an interesting theme.
It's strange to have that posture when you're on top, I don't know. I think like there's still was certainly, I would say a boogeyman in China that really like covered almost every single panel. It was very, that was the tone in this circle in particular. And I think honestly, more broadly in Silicon Valley now, that's just established to be the case.
Yeah. I want to hear the first principles reasoning from Josh Wolfe, who we'll talk to in a second, from Lux.
Josh was actually one of the voices that was like a little more moderating on the tariffs for sure. We should be, ramping up this onshoring before we put the hammer down entirely, and try like targeted efforts rather than blanket price increases on all of this before we have the technology really here. Right. So that was, refreshing to hear.
The whole point of the tariffs is supposed to be, I mean, there's an American resilience and sort of national defense part, and that's important. But for the Trump people, it's about jobs and what sort of American life works like. Was the Silicon Valley set salivating over robots at this event, or what was the balance between excitement over robots and human American workers getting jobs because of all of this?
That was also a thing where I feel like, okay, you're having both, like where do you land on this? Where's the reality? But I think people were very on message about the robotics boom in factories enhances our workers to be more productive rather than they'll totally take all the jobs. Jensen Huang spoke on stage from NVIDIA and, touted his plan to invest $500 billion in chip manufacturing in the US over the next few years. And within that, he was talking about all the work that will come from skilled laborers, modeling the factories with digital twins to, ramp out, solve all the problems before they get on the floor, and then have all those jobs to be manufacturing chips, and that being, really important for our trade workers to bring in, and also just, building the factories themselves will take a lot of American labor. So that was kind of I would say the party line of the event about how this would work. I do still feel like it wasn't really answered how all of this will happen when all the raw materials are tariffed out of existence coming into the country.
Right.
But
if we don't have the minerals from China, we're in big trouble. Excited to hear from Josh. He was on stage at Hill and Valley. What should people know about what he said on stage before we start grilling him?
Yeah, Josh moderated a panel with Senator Jack Reed, and Josh's panel was all about autonomy and national defense against China, with Senator Jack Reed and Kesar Yunus from Applied Intuition, and where AI technology and robotic intersect with national security and how all of that is really relevant going forward. So happy to chat more about that too. Josh, good to see you again. Thanks so much for coming on.
Great to see you both. How are you doing?
For those of us who were not at Hill and Valley, do you want to just say what was your core message on your panel, or what do you think you were trying to get across?
Well, our core message was very focused because I had an amazing entrepreneur that we backed from the beginning, Kesar Yunus, who was the founder of Applied Intuition. I got to tell you, we've got hundreds of companies that we've invested in. It is, I believe, the only actual cash flow positive business, which is just insane. He's a crazy operator. He is all focused on autonomy for AVs, for commercial sector, and then for defense, because it's effectively the same thing. If you're trying to figure out how to get a car to be autonomously navigated, and you're trying to figure out how to get a tank or a plane or something else, it's vehicles and things that are moving. So a big focus on our center, which was also with Senator Reed from Rhode Island, was how do you balance American competitiveness? How do you balance the fact that these things being autonomous vehicles, data centers on wheels, and the security and vulnerability, because those are threat vectors that adversaries, particularly China, but you could also think about Iran, North Korea, Russia, want to penetrate. Kesar had just gotten back from China, so he was able to sort of report out. He would tell you that the AV industry and the EV industry there are not only huge, but winning.
He also talked about the surveillance state experience being there, like how different it is technologically.
Yeah, that's no surprise. I think the last time I was in Beijing, Shanghai, Hangzhou was 2019, right before COVID. Maybe it was early 2020. I think it's the last time I'll be able to go for a while until there's regime change, which may not happen in my lifetime, just because of how outspoken I am on the Chinese Communist Party. But I remember my wife was saying, make sure you use separate phones and all this kind of stuff. And, and I do, and I did. But the second you land, it's fingerprints, facial ID, like you're captured and you're tracked everywhere. And that's only improved. And that was really before the rise of the data capture was there, but the AI and the algos to do identification were just coming to fore. So, that's one of the great things that I think people think that technology is always this great democratizing force, and it's going to give people more expression and more freedom and more access and more connectivity, and it can do that.
But not necessarily.
Yeah. But it can also be used as a tool of oppression. Private companies there, as you know, are mandated to be part of the military-civil fusion, which is if you make something, the government, has effective full margin rights to basically just say that's going to be used by us to make sure we advance whatever principles we need to advance here or abroad.
Well, in some ways, this event was cheering a military-civil fusion of American companies with U.S. government. Or how do you, as someone sort of troubled about that in China, how do you see sort of the U.S. taking sort of a different, more noble path while making sure that the government is getting the best technology it can?
Well, it's something Kesar and I, the senator, were talking about, which is, there's a few lines in our Constitution, which are the distinction between a surveillance state and individual freedoms. And, as many have said, democracy is, the worst of all systems, but, it's the least worst or the best of a whole bunch of bad systems. But our system is the best in the world. I don't want to live in a theocracy. I don't want to live in an authoritarian or totalitarian state. Technology can be used by leaders of those states and has been from Hitler and Mussolini, who commandeered radio. We thought that would be a great liberating thing. But I think that the big message here was like why the U.S. is different is it isn't like this BS, rah-rah, freedom, jingoistic. It really is not trying to suppress individuals. It is not trying to create a social score based on whether you pledge fealty to the great leader and whether you will be allowed onto the train or whether your kids will get admission into a school or you will get show tickets to the concert. This mechanism, which is straight out of Black Mirror, it makes Black Mirror writers look totally uncreative because it's real. It might have been presaged half a decade ago, but it's very real.
Didn't we just see, Chris Krebs, who had sort of spoken out against Trump, is now alleging literally today he lost global entry status because of, he presumes, sort of anger from the Trump administration.
I have no idea.
You don't know that example, but I'm just saying what you're describing, it sort of fit. I don't think we're so insulated from that potential in the United States, or you feel?
I think, look, that is a right and just fear that anybody should have about people pledging loyalty or authoritarian instincts and how technology can be used in those ways. And, all those things are very complicated, but we do have freedom of speech here, and we do have freedom of expression and freedom of religion, freedom of sexuality, right. Marry.
Yeah, Ryan Peterson just posted, like, I've been shitting on the Trump administration over tariffs and nobody's coming for me. It's been great to have freedom of speech.
Right. Look, I did not vote for Trump. I didn't vote for Kamala. I voted actually. Hold on. Ready? I think there were 7 people in my party.
I know. Romney.
Well, I gotta be honest. Hold on. I made these hats before I consulted with my boss, which is my wife. Okay. And one of the top issues in our household is women's rights broadly and reproductive rights. So she reminded me that I needed to flip the ticket, which I did. So when I voted, it was Bloomberg, Romney, but
so I got asked at HumanX, my favorite billionaire, and I worked for Bloomberg. I said Bloomberg, I think, was my favorite billionaire. So I not wrong. Never going to get elected, unfortunately.
No, I truly felt, and this is a weird thing to say, that I think that billionaires should run for office and hold office. And whether Mitt was a billionaire or close to one, Trump was not really a billionaire when he was running. Maybe he became profiting off his name later. And the reason is I don't think that they could be bought. I don't really think that there was anything when Mike Bloomberg was running the city of New York where he could be bought. And frankly, when there were cuts to the arts here in the city, he reached into Bloomberg philanthropies, and it was like 100 million plus to keep up the arts. That's the kind of benevolent mayor I want. And is he driven by pure virtue? Probably not. It's probably his legacy and his reputation and his family and all that kind of stuff. But man, I wish he was a better debater. And,
yeah, you got to win the stage presence.
I do want to circle back a little bit to what we talked about at what was discussed at Hill and Valley this year. One big conversation, of course, was, around reshoring manufacturing. And part of that is made complicated by the fact that China has so many of the critical minerals. So with this aggressive tariff policy, they have things that we don't have yet. And maybe we do under reserves, but we need to get them, and that's going to take time. Where do you land on that liberating stance between a one-size-fits-all tariff policy and not? Like, how does that score with the reindustrialization mission?
Let me break it down from the top layer, which is the tariffs. And I will say either this was the greatest policy blunder and worst rollout in the history of presidential decrees in economic sphere, or, and I'm giving a lot of credence here. This is not what I believe, but I'm giving credence. It is part of a grander bargain, and particularly China. And the game theory that I could see playing out, and again, I don't know that this was a priori planned. I'm not giving them the credit to say that this was, some grand scheme of 4D chess. Okay. I think it was most likely that this was haphazard and chaotic, maybe ideological driven. I personally think that what happened is post-election, you had this boom of rah-rah golden age of America. It was like just an echo chamber of homogenous only up from here. And then you started to see big tech with the recomposition of Zuck's board and Meta. And you started to see one by one people taking the literal or figurative knee and $1 million for the inauguration one by one, and they're all lined up. And I think that there started to be a confidence from the administration of we are running the table and everybody is bending down to us. And I think that then got exacerbated onto the global stage. And it was sort of like, when the tariff thing happened, we control the cards. And China's like, yeah, we make the cards. So that's
You're
what I think.
you're saying tech capitulated so well. The Trump's like, oh, we're so powerful.
We're gonna keep running the table, right?
Right.
So I think that is probably the psychological confidence / overconfidence that led to that first part of why this rollout happened. Now, from here, I am more sanguine than everybody, and I'll tell you why. Beginning the tariff rollout 4 weeks ago, whatever it was, 4 weeks ago, I had friends that were reading hundreds of papers, hundreds of research reports, sell side, buy side, everything they could get. And I had other people that were reading nothing. I said, come Monday morning, both of you will know the exact same thing, which is nobody knows nothing. You have no idea what's going to happen. I was shocked by only one thing, which was that people were shocked by the tariffs. I mean, Trump has been talking about them for 25 years. He campaigned on them. Democrats hit him on the fact that he was going to do tariffs repeatedly. And then they do it. And it's like, okay, wait, there's a shock. So if you were long volatility, if you bought deep out of the money puts, like you did great. We happen to do that as a family because I was like, all I hear is positive, positive, positive. There's nowhere but down to go from here. So I don't know what the catalyst is going to be, but it just feels like something's going to crack. Okay, so that's the first part. What happens from here? If you were long volatility, you were right because Trump 1.0, it was all about chaos and crazy and volatility. Well, now you have volatility. If you are a country or a company, the number one thing that you hear from CEOs and executives and boards, they all have the same uniform consensus, which to me is always like, where's the variant perception? Everybody's like, we're paralyzed. We don't want to make CapEx decisions. We're not going to hire. Our demand signals are really noisy because a lot of people pulled forward demand. Consumers bought a lot of stuff because they're not sure themselves. And so you have this aberrant spike in sales for a lot of companies, but you have CapEx that's super low. You had GDP that came out negative for the first time in a very long time. So what's scarce today is predictability and stability. Okay, now go to the global stage. If you're Japan or Korea or India or Germany, and you are feeling the same thing because of this chaos, would you pay a premium to get stability and certainty and predictability for the next 5 years or 10 years? I think you might. Now, I don't think that was calculated, but my prediction, which is why I'm more sanguine, a week ago, JD Vance, Indian wife, goes to India, not a deal, but a deal to do a deal in India. Okay. But that's an important thing. It's 1.5 billion people of the world. Okay. Next, most populous country, China, 1.4 billion. We're 375 million people. So if India looks and says, we can do a deal here, maybe boost our aerospace and defense, maybe boost commercial.
So you think the outcome is that we have lower tariffs in some of these allied countries at the end of this, or that's what the wins situation is?
Here's my
like
prediction.
He wins if it but he likes tariffs. You just said that he believes in tariffs.
What he likes is winning. He likes deals. He likes leverage. It isn't the sake of tariffs. It's the sake of feeling that there's inequity, that somebody's getting a better deal. So we're going to twist the table so we get a better deal, right? That kind of thing. Now, if Japan comes to the table, and they are, and I got to tell you, Scott Bessent, close friend, I think he's one of, if not maybe the adult in the room. He is erudite, sophisticated, knows markets and currencies and bonds and history, but he also knows human nature. And people are like, why isn't he speaking out? Because he knows human nature. He's not going up against his boss so that he can get fired. And none of us want him fired.
Right. So it creates the most hysterical television interviews where you can't really. Yeah. Anyway,
Scott's recipe for the U.S. and when he was interviewing for the job and got it as Treasury Secretary was predicated on the Japan model of these sort of 3 arrows. And so I think that he will get a deal with Japan, a deal with India, a deal with South Korea. And by the way, if you're a South Korean motor manufacturer and you have 4% market share in the US or something like that, because China's got 50 or 60%, would you do a deal that says, hey, we'll do a 10-year deal with you. The government and defense and a bunch of our other industries are going to buy from you. We're going to keep tariffs high on China. Your market shares can go from 4 to 12 or 16. You're going to triple or quadruple your ownership. I think that we might see a grand bargain with a bunch of those countries. And then the big thing, which is probably going to take 2 years, is China. And the optimistic view here is you get not just trade, but remember, it's a whole bunch of stuff that's on the table. TikTok. Is the delay on TikTok really about the delay so they can figure it out and find a buyer? Or is it that and part of a grand bargain with China? Fentanyl, IP. There's a whole bunch of other things to figure out in this grand bargain, and all these things are chits on the table. So I'm a little bit more sanguine.
I am much more skeptical than you. I mean, first of all, Japan, it could very well drive them closer to China, and there have been signs of that. You're omitting Europe, which is our most important set of allies, which are really turned off by this. And finally, we just had the Canadian election where Trump rallied the whole country to the Liberal Party when they probably would have gone conservative. just that is a great bellwether that our global allies are not reading this tariff strategy as making friends and bringing them closer.
I'm shaking my head violently because you are 100% correct on the media, the newspapers, the popular opinion culture. Okay. But Canada.
But like, if you're screaming at your friend.
Canada, relatively irrelevant, like in the big scheme of things. It's certainly for our defense.
It's one of our closest trading partners.
That's right. Yeah. And they need us and we need them and it'll work out. And okay, it'll be fine. We'll have like a little bit of schoolyard fight, but it'll work out. Europe, who are they turning to for the security umbrella? Literally, who are they turning to? They're going to go
themselves.
to China. They're going to go.
Hope.
How long is that going to take? How long is that going to take to build up a defense base? Who's making F-35s for them? I am way more. You are 100% correct that popular opinion, tourists, the media, entertainment companies, like the mass.
But that's not the media. It's the regular people, human beings, the massive human beings. Yes. Right. Tourists, right.
99% of people could be like, Americans suck under Trump. I'm not going there or whatever.
Right.
But the people that matter are the generals and the war fighters. And they're not saying, yeah, we don't like Trump. He's a dick. We're not going to buy weapon systems. The entire world depends on cheap manufacturing from China, oil and nat gas, mostly from the Mideast, and weapon systems from the United States. And unfortunately, those weapon systems really matter.
They do matter, but I guess I'm curious to see if they're the only thing that matters. There's lots else going on.
No, they don't know. But I just think that the average person on the street is not like, I hate America, so I'm not selling. You have no say in whether weapon systems are sold. You have a say whether you're subscribing to Netflix or you're buying American fashion brands or you're tweeting and yelling about America. But I'm telling you that the $1 trillion defense budget and the enormity of our industrial defense base globally, which needs to be refreshed domestically, is just a major source of leverage that the average person takes for granted because they never think about it.
I mean, what do you see as like the goal here? I mean, like, to me, the goals would be, like get to a free trade environment, avoid war with China, which would include avoiding an actual like invasion of Taiwan. Like, I guess to me, the Trump stuff I'm seeing, we're eroding free trade. We're making it, with Ukraine and other things, the signals are that we're less likely to defend Taiwan. So I don't know, what are we building up all this military might for if at the same time we seem totally disinclined to mount the two greatest fronts we're likely to face, one being Ukraine and the other one defending Taiwan? Like what is all this militarization for?
I would actually contend that the two biggest fronts are ones that people are not talking about, and I'll give you what they are in a moment. But Ukraine, minerals deal, either imminent, signed, but like going to get done. The U.S. cares a lot more about Ukraine when we do that deal. Okay, so now under the security umbrella,
Trump specifically feels like, yes.
But just in general, like it could be about defending Western democracy or the buffer of Putin's encroachment into NATO and our allies. But now America cares, whether it was about oil.
America cared. Most of America. I just am taking issue with this idea that America didn't care. Trump didn't care. America cared about Ukraine because it was a buffer. All the other things were true besides the mineral deal. The mineral deal exists to make Trump care.
Yeah, but what I'm saying now is, if you're just, again, seeing like a state, if you are Ukraine as a state and you're America, now I've given you, America, a interest. Would you persuade interest, not reason? We are all aligned. Like, American values, Western values.
Right. Now we have one more reason to care about Ukraine.
Dictators.
One that might be compelling to Trump. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. And Trump, but just as a country, it's sort of like, well, even Americans who vote for Trump, and I'm just not one of them, that's like, why do we care about Ukraine? Okay, well, now there's a reason to care about Ukraine. In your own self-interest, there are minerals there that affect the jobs and the robots and the autonomous cars and the future machinery that we have because we need that stuff. So we're going to protect it and not let Putin get that. Okay, so that's Ukraine. Taiwan, there won't, in my personal opinion, be an invasion.
Interesting.
China will take Taiwan. I don't know.
It just won't need an invasion.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Well,
it'll be Hong Kong. Now, what they will do, because they can, is continue to build up. They've got 200x the shipbuilding capability that we do. They've got roughly 400 warfighters today on maritime. We've got 300 and something. The shape of the battle that they have in their ability to spend to build that up is sort of, not entirely, but sort of like what we did during the Cold War, where we effectively bankrupted Russia with this arms race. Okay. So it is in their strategic economic interest to get us to try to match parity with what they're building, but what they're building is useful for other conflicts that may arise in the future. Okay. But all they have to do, there are 100 flights a day or whatever it is, between Taipei and Shanghai. You just send the equivalent of like the little orange men, and all of a sudden one weekend, there's some mainlander that gets beaten up by a bunch of thugs or something like that. And there's a peacekeeping force that comes in, and it's Hong Konged over a weekend. So I don't know why they would go to kinetic battle. I am friends with Sam Paparo, Indo-PACOM. He wants to create a hellscape. I applaud it. I think we should do it. We stand to benefit as all the attritable systems and drones from Anduril and Saildrone and others help to blockade and prevent freedom of navigation maneuver for the Chinese around important strategic areas. But if I'm China, that's like checkers, right? Like,
but you're saying Taiwan's lost, America should invest in trying to stop it.
No, China's smartest thing that they can do is continue to build up their arms, let America do it, do their little exercises, provoke people, provoke the Philippines, just try to do all that stuff. And then let America build TSMC in the United States, let Intel finally convert into a manufacturing for other people's semis, which is what they should have been doing, and I called for over the past 10 years because they no longer make competitive chips. And then Americans are looking at like, why do we care about Taiwan? Now, we three and the rest of democracy might care about it because it's a values-based thing, but in pure economic interest, why would we care about Taiwan other than the fact that our chips are made there? And if chips are now made in the U.S., and
I'm very interested in your. Okay, I don't. We quibble on some
by the way,
things.
I hope you see. I'm not being like ideological about this. It's real politics. It's like really understanding what are the interests, what are the means, what motivates people.
But where do you think the real conflicts are? You sort of alluded to not Ukraine and Taiwan.
Okay, you make me SecDef or Sec State for the day, or you let me advise, and I've said this publicly. There are two areas, two regions, one broad, one narrow, that I think are going to be the next chaotic areas. And the problem with so much conflict and war is that we react to things instead of proactively preempt. The first is the Sahel and Maghreb. I pause.
I don't even know. Yeah, I have no idea what you're talking about.
And that's why. And most people that are listening, Sahel and Maghreb are the latitudinal areas of Africa. And they have had coup state after coup state. Most people couldn't even name some of the countries. Chad, Niger, Mali, Sudan, etc. Okay? Three forces are, am I allowed to curse here? Are fucking this place up, okay? Big time. You got Russian mercenaries who are coming in, making money, propping up warlords, propping up coups, extracting resources. And there's a whole economic chain of what they do with those resources and how they clean them and get money, okay? And other people that are involved in that. The second are Chinese, Communist Party, that are coming in with infrastructure, telecom, roads, et cetera, and having influence. And the third are Islamists that are coming from Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq, that have fought wars for the past 20 years and are radicalizing young men and spreading this violent extremism. We are, in my opinion, I don't know if it happens in 6 months or 6 years, but I think that's the window. One terror event away from one of those ISIS in Africa or Al-Qaeda in Africa type groups projecting into Paris or Barcelona or London, away from that entire region becoming our next Afghanistan at a time when US troops have been pushed out, French troops have been pushed out. And I think that is going to be like chaos central. Okay. So, and again, my life is spent trying to find a low probability, high magnitude thing that other people haven't found. I do it in technology. If I was in the music world, I'd be trying to find the next band. If I was in real estate, I'd be trying to find the next hot neighborhood or fashion or art or whatever. But in geopolitics, it's what's the thing that nobody has attention on, where there are bad actors convening, like out of a movie, and we are not there proactively friendship building, winning hearts and minds, doing commerce, all the things that can diffuse these people.
Say also, we've, seen a lot of cuts to US aid and a lot of what I would call our, soft power mechanism over the last, 3 months. Like, how does that play into all of this? Should we be ramping that more up as well in addition to military force?
Strategically, yes. Soft power matters. Soft power matters. But if, we're funding stupid shit, it should be cut. And if we're funding smart, wise, strategic stuff that is aligned with a broader strategy. I mean, the problem is you have different government entities that are focused on different things, but you need a grand strategy to say Africa is a concern for us.
All right. So number one is terrorism 2.0 out of Africa, which is
Correct.
Interesting. And the other?
I would create a Monroe Doctrine number 2, which shores up a Pax Pan Americana of North, South, and Central America. And the reason is, if you've been down there, my bet is you went to Patagonia or Brazil, or you saw Iguazu Falls, or you went to Costa Rica, maybe you went to Honduras or Jamaica. The infiltration of the Chinese Communist Party into all of these places that Americans travel is like what the Russians did with Cuba back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Right, which is why we shouldn't be alienating Mexico. Like, there's no country I love more than Mexico.
Mexico ultimately loves us too, but
I know we're fine, but like, it was so dumb to have.
But it's the rest of this region.
Like, right,
we've got 1 billion people that mostly speak 80% Spanish and English, except for Portuguese in Brazil. You have abundant natural resources, abundant agriculture, highly trained, highly literate populations, and the quiet Chinese infiltration literally into our sphere of influence on this Western hemisphere. We should have a hemispheric hegemony that creates a new allied longitudinal axis so that we can project power from the Atlantic and the Pacific and not be vulnerable from all these states. I was in Nicaragua in December. I was terrified. You literally have Iranian Hezbollah forces in Nicaragua. I have a best friend who's a journalist, a prominent one, and our families were traveling together, and he was stopped at the airport in Miami and denied boarding the flight because he was a journalist.
We're leaving the U.S.
From the U.S. to Nicaragua, yes.
But by the U.S. or by
no, but by the Nicaraguan government. They said you can get on the flight, but if you land, we're detaining you.
Interesting. I guess what I want to understand, I think these are both interesting and like provocative, but like, to me, a premise of what's going on in Hilo Valley and American dynamism and all the defense tech investing is sort of this global face-off with China. And like, a key question is, what types of companies do we invest in? Because like, what does the nature of that conflict look like? I mean, do you think China is powering this investment movement? And if you don't see it as a sort of head-to-head war between the two countries in Taiwan or even sort of like a proxy Taiwan war, like what is it? It's like fighting terrorism again because there are influences in these regions you talked about, or why is China so important if you're not bringing that up?
I think the catalyzing force over the past few years was people complaining about the defense base we have, that it's slow and bureaucratic, whether people were criticizing the F-35 Joint Strike Fighter being made in 350 plus congressional districts and being over time and over budget. And that's a thing for taxpayers justly. Or that China was developing hypersonic missiles, or when people saw DeepSeek, and that's a whole other complicated thing, but more efficient, maybe less GPUs, stolen, not whatever it is. And people saying, are we losing on a bunch of different fronts? And I think there are 44 key technological areas, and some studies have shown that on 37 of them, we are losing to China. 50% of undergraduates in AI are...
China's more of a benchmark. It's more like we just need to do things really well. And you're like, China's like a comparison point.
Yes. And so if we are... But Sputnik was that moment for us that presaged the Cold War and build up and whatever. But it was like, holy shit, America is great. That's great. But if we're not great and they're actually beating us, you can be the president, you could lie about how big your buildings are and how big your bank account is and how big your crowds are, but you can't lie about the market, right? Market goes up or down. You can't lie about how much it went up or out. Everybody feels that. And you can't lie when you see that China is flying a satellite or launching a satellite or releasing an AI tool that actually empirically, observably shocks you. And so I think people have been shocked now to say, are we behind? Do we risk being behind? You take shipbuilding, something I mentioned before, the stat, 200 times the capability in China than we have. We have one major shipbuilding area in Hampton Roads. We've run these risk games at Lutz to analyze the vulnerabilities of this kind of stuff. We used to have 25. And so reshoring, something that you mentioned before, it's not, Scott Besson said, America first does not mean America alone. Are we going to truly do shipbuilding here alone? I don't know. There's going to be probably in this defense budget with reconciliations, something like $47 billion of the $1 trillion that gets allocated for shipbuilding. But South Korea, Norway, a bunch of people are amazing shipbuilders, and we should be partnering with them, whether there or here or both, to do that. Same thing, Taiwan coming here, building. Intel should probably team with TSMC. Maybe TSMC buys them. I don't know. But we should be friend-shoring to do reshoring. It shouldn't be alone. I think that's foolhardy. Same thing, by the way, with minerals. Even more reason to be in Africa and South America. But the big grand strategy here, the big, like, why Hill and Valley, what's happening here, is what people have been talking about for a very long time of, like, we're falling behind. All of a sudden, you had a culture shift with Project Maven, Google employees walking out, a bunch of other companies, including one of ours, Clarify, that came in and won those contracts. You had the rise of DIU. You had the founding of Anduril 7.5 years ago, and we were founding investors there. And people thought Palmer was a joke. Peter Thiel and I are at the Reagan National Forum, and Palmer's in his Hawaiian shirt, cargo pants, and flip-flops. My guess is 5% of the people, maybe 10% of the people that attended there back 6-7 years ago have applied for a job at Anduril since, right? And so Anduril went from nothing and nobody to a $30 billion company, and people are like, holy shit, this thing is working. And it inspired other people to be like, we're going to go do that, but in a different sector or whatever it is. And so you have a move of self-interest and motivation that people don't want to work on ads and video games and bullshit. They want to work on things that matter. And right now there is a zeitgeist that feels that American defense matters. And you have the Hill and Valley where you have aging politicians that get lobbied from, like, the big primes and get donations from the big primes. But now they see, wait a second, there's a lot of money here. Venture capitalists.
In some ways, what's happening is what we're telling ourselves, a psychological story. There will be more money to come. Silicon Valley is committed to this area, telling politicians that they need to, like, look to startups and not just rely on the primes.
And leaders seem more bought into it too. I would say, like, the event was very positively received.
I mean, I can tell you from conversations with people that are doing these budgets and doing these bills, you're going to see big wins for new manufacturing technologies. You're going to see big wins away from the major primes, who I think are sitting there fat and lazy, and they're going to be shocked. And so you have this generational moment from, like, that Last Supper, you know, when defense was told, post-Cold War, budget's getting shrunk. You guys all have to merge together. And they merged into an oligopoly. And you had Raytheon and L3 and Boeing and Lockheed, et cetera. Okay. And now you have a emergence of winning tech companies that are attracting the best talent, innovating and making technology faster and winning. And I think it's a wake-up call. So let me be clear. The big takeaway I had from Hill and Valley is that the politicians keep getting older, but the attendees keep getting younger. And the younger people are the ones that have the mix, which is that beautiful cocktail combination of ambition, naivete, and they're the ones that make shit happen. They're the people that we invest with. And so those people are inspired and excited, and they're not naive in how long it will take. They're not like suddenly, oh, we're going to get $1 billion contract this year. And it is always dangerous to say this time is different, but there is something palpably different that I think we're going to see in this budget when it gets done, next year's budget, and you're going to start to see, like, wow, market share is really accruing to these new primes, these new entrants like Anduril and Saildrone and Hadrian and Varda and Impulse Space.
We'll let you go, but in a way, do you think the enthusiasm from the administration and from funders can overwhelm potential economic headwinds? Like, if the economy is in a bad place, do you think this enthusiasm is misplaced, or you think, you know, some trends can overwhelm a broader economic situation?
The evidence that it will overwhelm is, again, if you look right now at Anduril as one example, $8.5 billion of demand for a $2.5 billion round. You know, nobody there was like, you know, like, we're feeling really nervous. Like, interest rates are at 4.2. The 10-year just spiked, unemployment, the GDP print, like, nobody cares. So there are going to be isolated pockets that will overcome the economic thing. But you are naive. Anybody is naive to think that the macro doesn't matter. I always say, we pick individual companies. We find individual entrepreneurs. It's the most micro decision that you can make. And it's the equivalent of picking the best dish on a menu, having selected the best menu from a restaurant and best restaurant from a city and a state. And you're about to eat that delicious morsel, and Godzilla comes and just steps on it.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
You need to have an appreciation of the macro, and whether that's the cost of capital and rates, whether that's the flow of capital, and if Japan and China sell our bonds, it's just complicated. I do believe that there are these long-term trends that you can be relatively insulated from the volatility and vicissitudes of the here and now in markets.
Josh, thanks so much for coming on. This was awesome.
Great to see you both.
See ya.